Another arrest has been made in connection with the torching of a police vehicle outside the Senekal Magistrate's Court in the Free State last week. Friday saw a tense standoff amid protests over the killing of farm manager Brendin Horner. When two suspects appeared in court yesterday, the farming community and various political parties used the court hearing to voice their views on crime and racial divisions. We're joined now by Terry Oakley-Smith, founder and Managing Director of Diversi-T, to talk more about this, how the issue has once again come to the forefront, that of race and racial divisions, discrimination. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Terry. So, has Senekal simply ripped the Band-Aid off a weak transformative trajectory, or do we have to realize that as a nation that the architecture of this country was built on discrimination, particularly, that we can't ignore it? It's a cancer that permeates every aspect of our lives.
You're right, Sipiso. Much though we'd like to think that we can put a Band-Aid over it by talking to people who are racist, by sending people to the Human Rights Commission, etc. Clearly, racism is something systemic that impacts our whole society. I mean, I think it's evident even in the way Senekal was played out. The white privilege that was shown to the demonstrators who were farmers from Senekal on that actual day, on the Friday, as opposed to the way that black demonstrators would normally be treated if they were trying to get into a courtroom, overturn a police vehicle. It's very likely that there would have been rubber bullets, tear gas at the very least. And in fact, there were no arrests even made until the next day. So I think that underpinning the whole issue of race in South Africa, we have to be very conscious of white privilege. And I say that as a white person. I think as well, the inequality that permeates our country and continues to, after 27 years it is now of democracy, the terrible poverty, Tsepiso, the rural-urban divides. If one goes into the rural areas and sees how people live there, you realize immediately that the 350 Rand a month grant really can't be going very far.
Terry, let me jump in and say this. You know, a while, in fact, I think it was years ago, Pierre de Vos in his inaugural lecture when he was graduating, he was suggesting that even the Constitutional Court doesn't always get race quite right. And he was asking, are we having a nuanced discussion on race? So I will ask you, given what you have just laid as the foundation for why we are where we are at the moment.
Well, I think it's because we haven't really we haven't seized the bull by the horns since 1994. We addressed racism as a kind of nice to have. We talked about things like rainbow nations, which was obviously a myth. And we never really got to grips with the inequality in the country. And because the inequality in South Africa is along racial lines, obviously race permeates the way people live. If we look at business, for example, the latest Employment Equity Commission shows us that white men still occupy the top management positions in the vast majority of companies. So we have to ask ourselves, what have we actually been doing to address inequality and racism the way it plays out?
So how do we do that? Because you mentioned how it obviously is institutionalized. We know this, apartheid being what it is. But is the problem that institutions remain untransformed because race and its categorizations and the disadvantage, for instance, are the bedrock of laws and policies for redress? Are we reducing individuals to symbols and representations of their racial or language groups?
No, I don't think we're doing that, Sipiso. I think that one of the problems is that we have quite a good bedrock of legislation. If one looks, for example, at the Employment Equity Act, which is the sort of commanding act above BEE and so on, we see that many companies are not complying with employment equity. And those that are sending in the same report year after year after year. So we have a government in place that isn't able to monitor that isn't able to ensure compliance with the very good laws that they've put in place. And I think that's part of the problem. I think the other part of the problem, that's the systemic organizational side. There's obviously also an interpersonal side to racism. Very few South Africans, I think it's about 13 or 14%, actually have close friendships with people of other race groups. They wouldn't have people over for dinner, say, or do things together as they would with friends of their same race. So there's still a huge divide between South Africans. Yes, the workplace is a good place for people to get together, but even in the workplace, there are divisions. And I think business has a very important role to play in trying to bridge some of those divides.
And there's a question that I asked as an introduction, so our viewers can think about that. And I was talking about intent, the fact that it said that individual racist actions in isolations don't necessarily make a racist, but at the same time that if there is a malicious intent, it does not necessarily mean that it's an excuse for being racist. If you look at some of the scenes that occurred in Senekal yesterday, I mean, speak very much to that. EFF, for instance, was saying that land issue is a very important thing, but then farm attacks are being used to obscure the fact that South Africa hasn't dealt with that issue, for instance. And we've seen some of the farmers saying that there are farm killings and it's being perpetrated by black people, but there are those who are saying it's individuals who are dying and it's farming communities that are being attacked. So how deliberate are we and what are we saying and in the solutions that we're trying to direct? Hi, Terry. Okay, it seems like, unfortunately, we've lost the sound to Terry Oakley-Smith. It's a pity that we couldn't continue with that discussion, but I'm sure a lot of you are having this discussion at home. You would like to share your views with us, please do so. Terry Oakley-Smith is the founder and managing director of Diversi-T, and of course this conversation continues in the country. It's one we have year in, year out. Okay, we do have Terry Oakley-Smith back on the line. So if I could just allow you to complete that train of thought, Terry.
Yes, I was just going to say that, interestingly enough, I found myself agreeing with such a lot that the EFF was saying in Senekal, because it does go down fundamentally to the issue of land. If you look at the way the black farm workers are living, look, I realize that doesn't create any kind of excuse for the horrific murder of Brendin Horner. But I think if one just looks at the way 26, 27 years after democracy, black workers are living and are treated, one can understand anger springing up. And I think as well that as well as being interpersonal and organizational, racism is also an individual thing. We all as human beings have biases, have prejudices. Most of us, thank heavens, don't play those out. But when we do play them out, then that's individual racism. So it interacts on so many different levels. And that's why we need to far more than have talk shops, Sepiso. We need to look at the laws that have been put in place to address racism. We need to make sure that they're monitored effectively by the Department of Labour and other departments. And we need to make sure that there is security provided for all of us, and especially for people who live in isolated areas, like, for example, our white farmers. And I think one of the most important things the white farmers can also do is build relationships with their black farm workers. Because if something goes wrong and they have a good relationship with their workers, they're likely to be tipped off or at least to be supported. And that's where the interpersonal racism comes in. So I think that's a very important aspect.
Let's talk about solutions, Terry. Can you really have direct solutions that don't acknowledge the source of the problem? And I mean, there are people who say, why do we keep on looking to the past? But if we talk about democratization, if we talk about constitutionalism, and people are still living in the situations that you've just described. We had a story about what's happening in Eyadini, in Philippi, and Cape Town, where people are forced to who have no sanitation. Let me just leave it there, because we can't really speak about just how dire those circumstances are without offending people. But that's the problem. The people are offended by their reality, and it's a reality that hasn't changed in more than 25 years.
There's an absolute lack of dignity for probably the majority of South Africans, including the ones you describe who are living in Philippines. And I think until we grasp the nettle and do something about the inequality, about the huge poverty, and also that we as white South Africans at least acknowledge, take some responsibility. We didn't even apologize for apartheid, Sepiso. There was no apology made on behalf of white people, and I don't regard F.W. de Klerk's, what he had to say, as an apology. So we're still living, most of us, in the same way that we've always lived, with the same kind of help we've always had, with the same opportunities, with the same lack of inconvenience. And that's a really important issue. I mean, if you look at something like unemployment, yes, 6% of white South Africans are unemployed. 41% of black South Africans are unemployed. And if we look at youth unemployment, the figures are even more startling. So something really significant needs to happen. And people need to understand that if we all love this country, and if we all want to make this country a suitable place for our children and our grandchildren to live, we've got to start addressing the fundamental problems.
Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your insights. Terry Oakley-Smith, founder and managing director of Diversi-T.